In November of 1877, winter didn't arrive politely in the Montana Territory. It came early, sharp, and without negotiation. Along Stillwater Creek, every cabin followed the same logic: a wood stove, a straight chimney, more fire when the temperature dropped. That system had kept people alive, barely. But one cabin began changing in a way that made neighbors stop their wagons and stare, not above the roofline, below the floor. While smoke still rose from a stone chimney like every other homestead, something else was taking shape underground. 6 feet beneath the cabin floor, river stones were being stacked and sealed with clay. Not for storage, not for shelter, but for heat. To the people watching, it looked like a mistake. Winter was weeks away. Wood piles were only half cut, and instead of preparing more fuel, this woman was digging into frozen earth. They laughed because in their minds, heat only did one thing: it rose. And anything buried underground would steal warmth, not preserve it. But she wasn't experimenting. She wasn't guessing. She was rebuilding a system that most people around her didn't even realize had ever existed. Here's the misunderstanding nearly everyone on the frontier shared. They believed surviving winter was about how much heat you could produce. More fire, more wood, more effort. But winter doesn't reward effort. It punishes inefficiency. No one was asking the more dangerous question: where does the heat go after the fire burns? Every straight chimney was doing exactly what it was designed to do: pull hot gases upward and eject them into the sky as fast as possible. So settlers fought the cold by feeding fires through the night, waking every 2 hours, burning wood just to keep the air warm for a moment. This cabin was designed around a different idea. Instead of trying to heat air, it was built to store heat. Instead of letting exhaust escape immediately, it was forced to slow down. Instead of warming space, it warmed mass: stone, earth, weight, and weight matters. Because heat behaves very differently when it's absorbed by something solid instead of floating away with smoke. At the time, almost no one along Stillwater Creek understood that distinction. They saw wasted labor. They saw risk. They saw a woman making what they assumed would be a fatal winter mistake. What they didn't see was that this system wasn't built for the fire itself. It was built for the moment after the fire went out. And winter was about to test whether that difference mattered. The frontier had a rule everyone believed was unbreakable: if you were cold, you needed more fire. And for most cabins, that rule seemed true, until it wasn't. On paper, the typical wood stove looked efficient. It burned hot. It heated quickly. It pushed warmth into the room almost immediately. But it hid a flaw that only revealed itself at night. Air is a terrible place to store heat. It warms fast, but it cools just as fast. The moment the fire weakened, the cabin began losing warmth through every surface: walls, roof, cracks between logs. And the chimney made sure nothing stayed long enough to matter. A straight chimney creates strong draft. That draft doesn't just remove smoke, it removes usable heat. Every minute the fire burned, a large portion of that heat was being pulled upward and discarded into the sky. So settlers responded the only way they knew how. They burned more wood. They kept the fire alive through the night. They woke every 2 hours to feed it. They traded sleep for survival. But here's the part few people understood. They weren't losing because they lacked fuel. They were losing because their heat had nowhere to stay. The underground system beneath this cabin was designed to solve that exact problem. Before the hot gases could escape through the chimney, they were redirected downward. Not to warm the ground randomly, but to move through a stone-lined chamber built specifically to absorb heat. This forced the exhaust to slow down, and when heat slows down, it transfers. Instead of racing upward and disappearing, the hot gases gave up their energy to stone and earth. Dense materials with one critical advantage: they don't release heat quickly. This wasn't about making the cabin hotter. It was about making it slower to cool. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. A metal stove behaves like a flare. It burns bright, then fades fast. Thermal mass behaves like a battery. It charges slowly and releases energy long after the source is gone. Most settlers were fighting winter hour by hour. This system was designed to survive the night. That's why the fire routine looked strange to outsiders. Instead of constant feeding, the fire was burned hot and controlled for a few hours in the evening. Once the stone mass was saturated, the fire could be allowed to die down. No midnight wake-ups. No panic when the flames dropped. The warmth was no longer tied to the presence of fire. It lived in the structure itself. This is where many people made the wrong assumption. They thought the system was trying to heat the earth. In reality, it was insulating heat from time. By separating warmth from active combustion, the cabin stopped reacting to every temperature drop outside. And winter hates systems that don't react. Because once the fire is no longer the single point of failure, cold loses its leverage. No one around Stillwater Creek had seen that before. Not because it was impossible, but because the idea had been forgotten. And the coming storm was about to prove whether remembering it was enough. Winter doesn't argue with ideas. It tests them. 2 days before Christmas of 1877, the temperature along Stillwater Creek collapsed. More than 20 degrees lost in a single afternoon. Wind pushed snow sideways across the valley, sealing cabins in ice and silence. This was the kind of cold that exposed weaknesses fast. In most homes, the routine became desperate. Fires were fed constantly. Stoves glowed red. Men woke through the night with numb hands just to keep flames alive. And still, the cold crept in. Water froze in buckets before dawn. Breath fogged the air indoors. The moment the fire weakened, the room followed, because nothing in those cabins could hold heat once the fire slowed. The underground system faced the same conditions, but it behaved very differently. The fire was burned hot in the early evening, long enough to charge the stone chamber beneath the floor. Once the mass absorbed its heat, the fire was allowed to fade. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, nothing changed quickly. That was the difference. Heat loss didn't stop, but it slowed. And slowing loss is often the same as winning. While other cabins reacted to every gust of wind and temperature drop, this one remained insulated from sudden change. Not sealed, not immune, just stable. The warmth wasn't dramatic. No roaring stove, no blast of hot air. It rose gently from the floor, spread evenly, and stayed. This is where most comparisons fail. People imagine heating as intensity, but in extreme cold, consistency matters more. A short burst of heat doesn't keep a body warm through the night. A steady environment does. By midnight, fires in nearby cabins were being fed again. By 2 a.m, hands were stiff and sleep was broken. Here, the firebox held only coals. The warmth came from below. By morning, the difference was impossible to ignore. In surrounding homes, wood piles were shrinking fast. Inside walls were rimed with frost. Fatigue showed in faces. In this cabin, the temperature had dropped, but not collapsed. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It carried warmth across time. And that's when attention shifted. People didn't talk about engineering. They didn't argue physics. They noticed behavior. No one had woken to feed the fire. No one had burned through half a wood stack overnight. No one had fought the cold hour by hour. This wasn't comfort. It was endurance. Winter had revealed something critical. Most cabins were trapped in a constant cycle of reaction. This one had stepped out of it. And when a system stops reacting to every shock, it stops failing the same way. The storm wasn't finished. The cold would deepen. And soon, the consequences wouldn't be measured in inconvenience, but in survival. The storm didn't just test cabins, it tested decisions. In one of the nearby homes, a child began coughing through the night, not from illness, but from cold that the body could no longer resist. The fire was fed harder, the stove glowed hotter, and still, the room never stabilized. Heat spiked, then vanished, again and again. By dawn, the choice was no longer theoretical. They wrapped the child in blankets and carried him through the wind to the cabin with the warm floor. When the door closed behind them, the difference was immediate. There was no blast of heat, no choking air, just warmth, rising steadily from below. The child stopped shivering, not because the room was hot, but because it no longer stole heat from his body every minute. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. As the storm continued, others followed. First the elderly, then families who had dismissed the system days earlier. No one asked how it worked. They asked how long the warmth lasted. Inside that cabin, the fire had already been out for hours, and still, the temperature held. This was the moment arguments ended. In surrounding homes, the costs were clear. Wood stacks were disappearing fast. Hands were numb from constant stoking. Sleep was fragmented into cold intervals. Here, the system demanded something different. Not more fuel, but patience. Burn hot, charge the mass. Let the structure do the rest. By the second night of the storm, people were counting. Not theories, but outcomes. One cabin burned half the wood. Another stayed warm longer. One required constant attention. The other required none. Denial doesn't collapse when ideas fail. It collapses when comparison becomes unavoidable. By morning, the cabin was full. No longer guests, witnesses. People sat on the floor and felt warmth rise through the boards. They measured time since the last fire. They looked at the untouched woodpile. No one laughed anymore. Because winter had delivered a verdict that couldn't be argued with. This system didn't win because it was clever. It won because it removed fire as the single point of failure. Once heat was stored instead of chased, cold lost its leverage. By the time the storm weakened, something had shifted in Stillwater Creek. People returned to their cabins, but they carried questions with them. Not, was this safe? Not, was this worth the work? But, how deep did you dig? How long is the flue? What kind of stone holds heat best? Those are not the questions of skeptics. They're the questions of people who have already decided. The solution had crossed a line. It was no longer unusual. It was proven. And when winter forces proof, tradition changes fast. When the storm finally broke and temperatures began to rise, life along Stillwater Creek returned to its routines. People went back to their cabins. Stoves burned again. Woodpiles continued to shrink. But something fundamental had changed. Not because anyone had been persuaded, not because a theory had won an argument, because winter had made the decision for them. The cabin with the underground stone chamber hadn't succeeded by producing more heat. It succeeded by losing less of it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Most heating systems are built around intensity. How hot can you get the fire? How fast can you warm the air? This system was built around control. Where does heat go? How long does it stay? What happens after the fire ends? The answers to those questions determined survival. Not effort, not endurance, not how much wood someone was willing to burn. That winter proved something people often forget. Heating is not about fire. It's about time. Air heats quickly and abandons you just as fast. Stone and earth heat slowly, but they remember. By storing warmth in mass instead of chasing it through flames, the system turned heat into something predictable. And predictability is what extreme environments demand. There was nothing revolutionary about the idea. Romans heated their buildings this way 2,000 years earlier. Korean homes used underfloor heating for centuries. Northern Europe relied on massive tile stoves that radiated warmth long after fires went out. The knowledge wasn't lost because it failed. It was lost because easier energy arrived. Coal, cheap fuel. Later, electricity and oil. When energy becomes abundant, efficiency becomes invisible. People stop designing buildings that cooperate with physics and start relying on systems that overpower it until conditions become harsh again. Then the old ideas return, not because they're nostalgic, but because they work. What spread along Stillwater Creek after that winter wasn't a blueprint. It was a way of thinking. People stopped asking how to burn more fuel. They started asking how to keep what they already had. They stopped fighting winter hour by hour. They began planning for the night. That shift from reaction to design is the real lesson of this story. Innovation doesn't always mean inventing something new. Sometimes it means remembering something old and applying it where it still belongs. The stones beneath that cabin floor didn't save lives because they were clever. They saved lives because they obeyed physics patiently. And when conditions become unforgiving, patience outlasts power. Long after the fire goes out, long after the storm passes, what remains isn't the flame. It's what was built to hold its heat.